Name, amen. All right. So we're going to go all the way back to creation. Um, Unfortunately, we don't know exactly where the garden was located. There are a wide range of opinions. There is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq, which is where most people land. They say that the Tigris and Euphrates just have been there since as long as we know. And so a lot of people are saying that because the Tigris and Euphrates, which this is not a good map, so I apologize, but I couldn't find a real good blown up map. But the Tigris and Euphrates run down here, so in like central to lower Iraq. And if you look at the outline of Iraq, it's a pretty big country, and it borders Syria, it borders Jordan, it borders Kuwait, it borders Iran, and my geography is terrible. I think that's Saudi Arabia down here. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So when we think of Iran, or Iraq rather, we think of desert, right? At least I do. When I think of Iraq, I think like blistering heat, forever sand dunes and desert, and they're all desert people. Iraq is incredibly diverse and incredibly beautiful. It has mountains that are snow-capped. The average temperature in Iraq in the summertime averages like 104 across the country. So it is it's an arid, hot climate. But what's incredible is that the Tigris and Euphrates just feed this fertile land, and it's so incredibly gorgeous. So I'm going to show you some pictures, just so you have an idea of what Iraq looks like. But the earliest civilization that can be traced is in Iraq, which I think is interesting, because if it is true that this is the original Tigris and Euphrates, which interestingly Ken Ham disagrees with. Ken Ham says he doesn't think that Iraq is the original place where the garden was. I don't think he gives very good evidence, so I'm actually going to go against Ken Ham on this and say that based on what scholars say and what archaeologists have found and how ancient of a civilization they found in Iraq, I think this is probably our best bet. And I think it's just interesting when you look at the country and juxtapose that against the scriptures. I'm going to get out of this view on this computer. I put it on full view. For those of you online, you're not missing a whole lot. We don't have these integrated in yet just because it's a lot of work. And we have to get a little bit creative with it. But if you look at some of these pictures of Iraq, I'll just kind of scroll through some of these, blow some of these up for you. So you see how fertile it is. You have, just incredible mountains there. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. See a lot of scenery like this. This picture up here, when I blow them up, they'll be in the top right-hand corner. It's pretty incredible. Actually, it looks like paradise, if you ask me. Can you imagine that? By the way, the city of U-R, some people pronounce it Ur. I think it's properly pronounced Who do we know in the Bible who was in the region of Ur? Yeah, Abraham. So I think, again, another good reason why this is a good candidate for the creation episode, because you have God's people that are concentrated in this area for a long, long time. and I just think it's geographically it makes sense. Based on some of the major stories in the Bible, it makes sense. Based on where people were concentrated, it makes sense. And based on archaeology, it makes sense. Again, the most ancient finds that we have of civilization are in Iraq and Syria. And so you have the major empires that were in this area too. The Assyrians, Babylonians, the major world powers were concentrated in this region. Isn't that cool? It's just so pretty. I don't know if you can see the water's crystal clear. You can see down probably a couple 100 feet. Then you still have ancient cities. You have, I think what's interesting is, as it relates to the flood, a lot of really neat stuff was found in Iraq. You have lots of stuff that's buried under sediment, a couple 100 feet of sediment that shows that there was definitely a massive worldwide flood. Archaeologists know this. There actually were multiple floods here, and there's one that's distinguished from the typical floods. What happens is in the very northern part of Iraq, you have these great big mountains that are snow-capped. They get masses and masses of snow. When that snow melts, the runoff is so fast and so hard that the Tigris and Euphrates, the two major rivers that run through Iraq, flood big time. And they go out to all these little side streams and rivers, and they flood the area. That's pretty common. Still today, that's very common. So you have layers of these floodlands that show that there have been some pretty major floods throughout history, but we have evidence that there was a widespread catastrophic flood that is not related to the ice melting off of these mountains. I think that's fascinating. So today, I want to go over some parts of a research paper that I wrote on creation, because this ties in directly. Some of you may or may not know that the Genesis account is not the oldest creation story. And, in fact, there is a creation story that closely parallels the biblical story. Now, of course, there are a lot of differences, but I always thought that was interesting, and so I wrote a research paper 17 years ago called Genesis 1, Science, Theology, or What? So I wanted to write, based on Genesis and the creation narrative, were the Hebrews really trying to write a historical view of creation? Was that their primary purpose, or was there a bigger purpose at play? And unfortunately, we don't have a lot from archaeology that can pinpoint creation. It's just an impossibility. Unless I'm proved otherwise, which could happen. It's pretty hard to prove through archaeology because they weren't building massive things in creation. It's just not accounted for in the scriptures. So what's accounted for in the scriptures is what? It's a narrative of what? Beginnings, right? In the beginning. The very first words of Genesis 1, chapter 1, in the beginning. So it traces history back to the very beginning, even before the earth was made. So what's interesting is I came up with the thesis that creation is written as a narrative to combat the other creation narratives that were out there, which is why they're closely paralleled. That's not the sole purpose, but that is a main purpose. The main purpose of Genesis chapter 1 was not to give this very scientific view to show that this is how God created everything, but instead it was written to show that God and only God created everything. And there's some pretty solid evidence, and you guys can agree or disagree, but certainly it opens up, I think, some interesting dialogue, and I would love to have some of that dialogue with you guys. Let me flip through and find some of the things here that I wrote, and I'll give you direct quotes from this. And if anybody's interested in seeing this, I have an electronic version that I'll be happy to share with you. And if anybody doesn't have access, you can have this physical copy, and I can make more copies of it. I said in Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." This verse naturally sparks a lot of interest among both scientists and theologians. Those who argue that Genesis 1 is scientific in nature try to explain how the world came into existence. There had to be a way in which matter came together to form the heavens and the earth. With the advance of modern science, several views arose concerning Genesis 1. One view is the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory, of course you guys are probably pretty familiar with that, says that between 10 and 20 billion years ago, the universe burst, and about 300,000 years after the burst, fireball cooled and formed particles and atoms of gases. So on and on and on, and I think just based on all the research, I think probably all of us would agree that's a pretty silly theory. That's right. Yeah. Right. Scientists say it's basically an impossibility. Even some really renowned scientists are saying it's total garbage. In fact, what's the one guy, physicist? What's his name? The paraplegic. Yeah, Stephen Hawking. So even he said that there was intelligent design, which is interesting because he's, at least was, this raging atheist. And he came back much later in life and he said, mathematically, there's intelligent design. You can't have all of these coincidences coming together over the course of time. So I think none of us here would argue that God didn't create the heavens and the earth. I know, based on reading a lot of the science, that it's an absolute mathematical impossibility for stuff to just drop out of the sky, come together. It defies every single theory, especially the second law of thermodynamics that says anything within a closed environment moves from what? Order to disorder. Look around the world. Look at what's happening. Is the earth putting itself together? Is it getting better? Or are we depleting Earth's resources? Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's, non-renewable resources that we're using up.
I don't even think we're a closed system.
Yeah, well, probably not completely, but nonetheless, I mean, look at civilization. Are we getting more advanced? Certainly technologically, there are some things that we're getting more advanced, but as a human race, are we getting more advanced, or are we looking around saying, what in the world is going on? Is there something in the air around the world, right? The world it's a mess.
Constant through history.
Yeah.
Well, and the rise and fall of civilization.
Yeah. So.
They reach an apex, and then it's like their brains melt.
Yeah.
And they go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone else.
Yeah.
Comes in later.
Yeah.
When they get their stuff together.
Yeah. So it's certainly cyclical, but it's not like this trajectory where we're getting so much smarter and so much more advanced, and we're becoming more peaceful humans, and we're all working together for the common good, right? It's not happening. So to buy into that theory that things just exploded, matter came together, which begs the question, where did the matter come from? But matter just happened to come together and make intelligent life, and you alter the axis of the earth even by a fraction of a degree, and we either burn up or we freeze. You alter the distance to the sun, and we either burn up or we freeze. You alter anything that makes up air. We all suffocate. We die. You can't have that many coincidences. I mean, millions and millions and millions and millions of coincidences. It can't happen.
You wrote that 17 years ago.
Yeah.
17 years ago, it was still a mathematical impossibility for the Big Bang to occur.
Absolutely.
20 million years ago, what never existed,
Yeah.
would also have been an impossibility because they also ignore the fact from nothing comes. And you just hit it. Where did that matter come from to start that little step?
Right.
And when you look at the theory, not a fact, but the theory of evolution or the theory of Big Bang, that theory is constantly changing. And
Yes.
Charles just said that
Yes.
now are changing. Why? Because they lie so much, they cheat so much,
Mm-hmm.
manipulate so much to where they just can't do it anymore. Now got to come up with another fantastic theory.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, even in the churches, and I would say Christian churches, you're going to have people that still buy into it.
Yeah.
That will still, and that's sort of what we'll be talking about on Wednesday, the difference of looking at Genesis as an account of what God did, as opposed to how did this theory get into the churches.
Yeah.
I think you're always going to have it.
Yeah.
And I don't know what Hawkins' faith was when he died. I think I do, because it didn't seem to change.
Yeah.
But when you look at the math and you look at it, even they have to come to a point and admit this is just crazy. So let's go back
Sure.
to the drawing board and come up with something else.
Yeah. Well, interesting kind of drawing on that point. The scientific theories constantly change, and they'll use the word fact. This is scientific fact, with everything. Global warming, scientific fact. On and on and on. Things become so politicized and become scientific fact, and anybody who thinks otherwise is an absolute moron, right? At least that's the way they paint it. What's interesting is all of these other creation myths that were written, the pagan creation myths, which some do predate the Genesis account. Those things, my question is, where are those religions now? Where are these people now? Those stories constantly changed. There was such elasticity in paganism. In fact, you see it throughout the Bible too, right? You have all these gods, and the Israelites are constantly changing which god they're trying to appease, and it's just constantly changing. There's Moloch, there's Baal, there's Ashtoreth, on and on and on and on. And you look at what they're doing in practice, and that's always changing. The one religion that never changes and has never changed, the God who has never changed, is the God of the Bible. It's the only one that never changes. It's the only creation story that has never changed. It's never changed. It's never been altered since the history of mankind.
I think sometimes scientists get so proud and prideful,
Yeah.
that they think they can outdo God. It's like
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to prove truth.
Yeah.
And even in the science, there was one that said there was the hand of God that they through looking at the stars and things like that.
Yeah.
And they even call it the hand of God.
Mm-hmm.
Yet they seem to want to be just above God.
Yeah.
They want to prove that this is how he did it,
Yeah.
instead of just looking at this way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm certainly not. I'm not knocking science. I think science, in a more pure form, has so much to offer. But it's an adulterated form, and science has become a religion. I mean, it's probably always been, but it becomes this religion where you come up with these theories, and you believe it and buy into it for a long time, and then something else comes along, and then you change it, you shift your theory. But there's no humility in that, because people can't just say, you know what, we were completely wrong. what they say is, well, we have these other theories that are, they back this first theory, but they shift that first theory and they mess it all around, and it's just bizarre stuff that goes on. But my point in this paper was I really wanted to find out, was God really concerned with showing us this literal creation narrative that says this is how I did it? On day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and then day 6, then day 7 I rested. Because a lot of us, I think, read it that way, and we tend to be so far on the side of literalism that that we become blinded to the actual narrative, to what God's trying to tell us. And so, my conclusion was that God was less concerned with showing us how it happened, and more concerned with showing us who he is. So I'll explain kind of what I mean by that, and then what I'll say too is that, one, I absolutely believe in the creation narrative, absolutely, hands down. I believe it to be very accurate, completely accurate.
Well, in Genesis, I will agree with you, because if you look at it, the only thing we really see on how God did it is that he breathed it into existence.
Yeah.
We see what he did.
Yeah.
He tells you what he did on day 1, day 2. So I would agree that he's not that concerned in sharing. We wouldn't understand anyway, I don't believe, of how he
Right.
created
Right.
it.
Yeah.
But what we see is that he did do it. And I
Yeah.
don't think it's that important as to how.
Yeah.
As you said, he did it.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, and I'll see if I can find this. I meant to highlight, and I ended up not highlighting, which I was like, oh, I'll remember what page that's on. No, it doesn't work that way. So one thing that's interesting, and if I can find it here, the Hebrew scriptures use the indefinite article a day for days 1 through, I think it's days 1 through 5, and then 6 and 7 it's the day, or maybe it's 1 through 4, then 5, 6, and 7 are the day. What's interesting about that, and it's not a mistake, it's not like the Hebrews got sloppy, and I mean they were incredibly precision, pinpoint accurate with their language. If you know anything about the Hebrew language, they're not dumb people. It's not a dumb language. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an editor who came back and changed it. It's important to the flow of the story that the first few days are the indefinite article, and what's interesting is the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures, which has been around since, when was Septuagint written? In the intertestamental period, but...
Well, actually, it's written during the time of Alexander the Great, around 331.
331 BC, yeah. So the Septuagint, which is the Greek copy of the Old Testament, written about 331 BC, they maintained that translation. So the Greek text also says for days 1, 2, 3, 4, I think it's 1 through 4, a day, and then the last days were the day, on the day 5, the day 6, the day 7. That's pretty significant, and I'll explain why if I can find this. I asked this. There's a further debate about Genesis 1. Could it allow things to be evolved over time? It's quite difficult to reconcile Genesis 1 and evolution, yet some continue to do it. Concerning Genesis 1:1, Leon Krass says, describing the situation before the first creative act, this verse focuses on primordial earth to be distinguished from the earth that is the dry land, and that appears later on day 3 above, which was the Spirit of God. But what does this say about evolution, if anything? He argues that there is no clear assertion of creation out of nothing. If things had to evolve, this would require a long creation process, much longer than 6 24-hour days. Christians have long debated over an instantaneous creation versus a gradual one, and Cass says that in this debate, everything depends on the nature and meaning of time, a subject that we shall mercifully not entangle ourselves with. And I said, Cass is right by noting that everything depends on the nature of time, but it's an issue that must be addressed. And then I go on, I said, several scholars, this is interesting to me, several scholars note that the use of the Hebrew words create, which in Hebrew is bara, and make, which is asa. So those two words are used in the creation narrative. That's interesting. Not everything is God created. There's a distinction between the things that God created and the things that God made. So bara, create, is used 5 times in chapter 1, referring only to God. And asa is used 8 times. John Clayton, some of you may know John Clayton, scientist who was an atheist, became a Christian. I'm good friends with John Clayton. He was an atheist that wished to prove that the Bible was a myth using modern science. On the contrary, as he did this, he found the biblical accounts to be very accurate. He later became a Christian. He notes the use of bara, create, and asa, make, and argues that God uses 2 different processes in creation. When God creates, this is called fiat creation. A being of a higher dimension has acted upon our 3-dimensional world, and in violation of our laws of science has created physical matter out of nothing. So creation is making something out of nothing. Making is taking things that have been created, and then you begin to make, you make the plants, the vegetation. The earth has been created, and now you make it come to life. That's interesting, and that's important. So what is involved in this process is the idea of molding or shaping something out of previously created material into a new form or situation. Both processes are recorded in Genesis 1. In fact, this idea is clarified in Genesis 2:3 when it says, "And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." In the Hebrew text, it uses both of those in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. Surely God could have created everything in 6 literal days, but is this what the author of Genesis 1 is concerned with? Here's where I talk about the articles. So, as mentioned before, the position that Genesis 1 gives a scientific account of creation largely hinges on the nature and meaning of time. The author of Genesis 1 left the definite article off of the Hebrew word for day, which is yom, on days 1 through 5. So it was days 1 through 5. I couldn't remember if it was 1 through 4 or 1 through 5. So days 1 through 5 was a day, a first day, a second day, a third day, a 4th day, a 5th day. And then there's this shift on the 6th day and on the 7th day. We miss that in the English because it's not translated that way. And that's really significant. I think it's very significant. So hence the sequence could be translated 1 day, a 2nd day, a 3rd day, a 4th day, a 5th day, and then the 6th day, the 7th day. It's interesting that the Septuagint translated the days in the same pattern as the oldest Old Testament manuscript, leaving the definite article off the first 5 days. David Sterchi believes Genesis 1 is not concerned with the length of the days or with the presenting the data in chronological order as the events took place. That does not mean that the truth was not presented in the creation account. I think that's really important too. That's not to say, well, it's a false narrative, because I don't think there's any untruths in the Genesis account whatsoever. In fact, Sterchi says one way to achieve literary freedom and still maintain truth in the process was to remove the confines of chronological syntax. And then I said it seems that the author was not concerned with defining time. For days 1 through 5, he calls them a day. There's another problem if one is to accept the 24-hour day theory. Not saying that it's not true, but there are some problems with it that we have to acknowledge. Genesis 2:5 says that there were no plants on the earth when God made man, for it had not rained, and there was no man to work the ground. However, Genesis 1 says that vegetation appeared on the 3rd day. One would also have to imagine the vegetation that flourished without the sun and the moon, because these were not created until the 4th day. So the sun and the moon are created on day 4. Meredith Klein concludes, purely exegetical considerations, therefore, compel the conclusion that the divine author has employed the imagery of an ordinary week to provide a figurative chronological framework for the account of his creative accounts. So anyway, my ultimate conclusion, and the reason I talk about it today, is to say none of us were there, so we don't know. The creation account, I think, is biblical. I think it's accurate. I think it's truthful. I think sometimes we get so hung up on whether it was a literal 6 days, 7 days, or could it have been longer, that we miss the whole point. And the whole point is that God is the author of life. God is the author of matter. God is the creator of matter. God is the author and creator of life. And God makes things out of that which he's already created. The scriptures are incredibly clear about that. There's only one God. There's only one creation story from the beginning to the end of time. That ran counter to every single creation narrative that was out there. Because in these creation narratives, it was all about the gods trying to rein in chaos, because it's just, from the beginning, there are wars and people are fighting, and that's how things were made. And the gods were fighting each other, and the gods were fighting with men, and the men were fighting for power with the gods, and vice versa. And it's just this complete, you read these stories, and I've read these creation accounts, and they're nuts. You read them, and you're like, what in the world? Who would fall down and worship this God? These are gods of confusion and gods of chaos. Whereas God comes in, and it's this nice, neat, incredibly powerful narrative that shows order. And if you line up days 1, 2, 3, put them on one side. I should do it this way. 1, 2, 3. And you look at days 4, 5, 6. If you picture a hinge in between them and do this, they align with each other perfectly. That's a literary method that the Hebrews were using, where on day 1, you have light separated from dark. Over here on day 4, you have the sun and the moon and the stars were created. Isn't that interesting? And on and on.
When we talk about getting involved or lost in or so much into debates, I would agree that's not a point that God is making. It is used, as we see, to give us an idea of maybe a work week and different things in Deuteronomy of what he did.
Yeah.
But if we look at the church, and we look at 6 days, and we look at evolution, and those that are in the church that buy into evolution, will they look to make those 6 days something they are not?
Yeah.
So I think the importance of sticking to 6 days, and as you were showing, it talks about, it mentions morning and night. That would be one literal 24-hour period.
Yeah.
It takes away anything that the church would bring into it to say that God actually had to take long. We have the age theory, gap theory in between.
Yep. Lots of different theories. Yeah.
So, not that we spend a lifetime saying 6 days is 6 days, but I think it's important for us to understand that 6 days is 6 days.
Yeah.
And that's the foundation of part of that creation time. And in
Yeah.
essence, also a good, probably it's a poor choice of word, but battle line to battle against evolution.
Yeah, and I want to make the point too, I'm not saying that God didn't create in 6 literal days. I have no problem whatsoever with the 6 literal days of creation. Certainly God can do it. God breathed everything into existence. Right, yeah. And I think there's something to God's design and his literary design and his narrative and everything else that shows his creativity in creation. I mean, if you look at some of the images from NASA and look at the magnificence and the power and the size of some of these stars that dwarf anything that we know in our solar system. And look at how many millions of solar systems there are. I'm talking entire solar systems, or billions, or whatever. I mean, it is, God is infinite. And I think God, as if to say, here's how big I am. God didn't have to create all these galaxies, right? all these solar systems. God didn't have to create that, but he did. And I think that's the magnificence of God. God's saying, if you ever have any question as to how powerful I am and how insignificant you are, here I'm going to show you. But the paradox of that is God also says, I'm going to show you how magnificently made you are. And it's so powerful. And so, I look at that and I'm like, I have zero problem whatsoever with a literal 6-day creation. I think that's probably very accurate. The thesis of my paper is that that's not God's main point, is to prove, see, it's 6 literal days as opposed to, a lengthy period. That's not the point of Genesis. It's just not. And there's so much power and so much strength and so much creativity in how it's even written that just speaks again to how powerful God is and how powerful his people are. And so I think that's what sets the God of the Bible above any other created God throughout the history of mankind. It's just, God is unprecedented from the very beginning. Out of the gate, the Hebrews are showing that God is more powerful than these other gods that are in the other creation narratives.
Now, I'm not disagreeing with your thesis,
Yeah.
but there's more to it. Removing the creation aspect of God's proving his power and might,
Uh-huh.
we need to remember to whom this is being written, which is to the average, what we call now the Jews. They weren't the Jews yet.
Right.
These are going to become a nation.
Yes.
And this is an authorship to provide them with their beginning key.
Yes.
So while I agree with the theology of what you're saying, I think we're missing the actual political binding reality to it as well.
Yeah. Very well put. Yeah.
When he says 6 days, the average Jew who's a slave
Mm-hmm.
out of Egypt is looking at this as God created in 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an order and organization that does show
Yes.
the power of God. But it means something else. And again, away from the theology to the, dare I say, practical application, it gives them something to bind to show who God is and where their roots and beginnings are.
Yes. Very well put. Very well put. Thank you. All right. Yes.
Thank you. Good job.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. So next week we'll get into some of the more the digging. We're going to dig in next week and actually look at the archaeology and the things that have been uncovered. We'll start with Abraham because that's where we really have the first significant historical stuff that we've uncovered. And it's pretty fascinating. So thank you all, and we'll see you in just a little bit.